Hi again. It's that time of year where I'm looking back over my photography from the past 12 months and select my 10 favorite photos that I created during that year. So this will be for 2023, and as always, these photos are the ones I liked for various reasons. They're my personal top 10, my favorites, but not necessarily technically perfect. That's not what I'm going for here. Each photo has a story behind it, and collectively they act as an inspiration for me to continue to create better photos and further develop my creativity. They're presented in a random order, close to what I took them in, but not all of them are in that order. So without any further ado, here we go. Now for this first photo, I started off the year by going to Botany Bay, which is in Botanical Beach Provincial Park here on Vancouver Island. The January weather can often be quite stormy, and as you can see from this, there was a bit of a stormy weather, but it wasn't anything overwhelming. So with this photo here, I thought the rock in the foreground provided some really nice foreground interest and sort of mimicked the island in the background. It's not that far between them, but the separation there does make the size appear sort of similar. So I thought that was quite interesting. I like the way the rock in the foreground here is jutting out from its surroundings, and the one in the background blends in with the sea around it, and it's sort of mirroring them. So that added some interest for me. In February of 2023, I drove from Vancouver Island down the west coast of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, all the way down into Oregon, and I ended up going about halfway down the Oregon coast. Unfortunately, the trip was far too short to go all the way to the southern end and work my way back. So this time, that's as far as I made it. I was able to get down to Bandon Beach, which is just a beautiful location, and that's where this photo here was from. The tide was coming in at the time. The sun had just set, and the colors were fading, really sort of pastel colors that I enjoyed. With the tide coming in like it was, I had to watch how quick it was coming in, because there was only one way out of the beach from where I was, and behind me was a bit of a cliff. So I had to get over to the right spot and up to safety before the tide got too far in. But I'd already checked the tide tables. I knew when it was coming in and had my route all planned out. So it wasn't really close, but it was as close as I'd want to get. I didn't really want to get soaked. Following up to the next photo here, this is on my way back from that trip in Oregon. I had first noticed these pilings and the bridge in the distance, which is the Astoria Megler Bridge. I believe that's how you say it. And that is on the right of the picture in the Washington State side, and off to the left beyond where you can see is where the bridge comes back on the Oregon State side. So on the way down, I had noticed this and planned to stop on the way back. When I stopped on the way back, it was perfect setup for a long exposure here, converting it to black and white and doing it very high key look to it. Sort of gave it exactly what I wanted. This bridge here, you're probably only seeing less than half of it. It's actually over 6.5 kilometers long, about 21,474 feet long. So, like I say, you're not seeing the whole bridge, that's for sure. Coming back here to Vancouver Island, I went up to this multi-tiered waterfall. And like many waterfalls, you can see at the rear of this one, there's a couple logs that have fallen and are partially in front of the waterfall, whereas the smaller waterfall in front is unobscured. But you see that quite commonly with waterfalls. There will be a log or two that have fallen in front, and it's just part of the way nature happens, the way logs fall and flow down rivers. I thought they're fine here where they are. My focus in this photo was more the closer fall, the smaller ones, and the patterns in the water that were caused by those little bubbles that were there in this long exposure with them swirling and streaking along. So I hope you enjoy that as well, but I thought it added a nice dynamic sense to the image. So moving on, every year growing up, I used to go to the Abbotsford International Air Show, and it was fantastic. They had truly an international scope with aircraft from all over. A great deal of them were military, and that probably had something to do with my interest in the military and eventually getting into the Canadian Armed Forces, which I'm now retired from. But it was a big influence on me, I'm sure. Anyway, I'd done that quite a few times when I was young and took photos with a Canon SLR camera back then, film. Unfortunately, those negatives are all lost. I don't have any of the photos left. And years later, about 2 years ago, I started to get more interested again. Last year, I went to the Abbotsford Air Show, took some more photos there. And this year, instead of going down there, at the beginning of the air show season, just before they start, the snowbirds come to Comox here on Vancouver Island and do some training flights, getting ready for the air show season. So this year, found out when it was. I went up there, and you don't get quite as close as the flight line, but you still get a pretty good view from there. I got this group of several of the snowbirds streaking up towards the sky with their smoke on, and I thought converting it to black and white really made it stand out, especially when I gave that sky that really dark feeling. And this is the final image. Hope you like it. Next, we're back here on Vancouver Island, a little bit farther south. We're actually looking south towards the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State from Vancouver Island. So you can see beautiful sunsets like this in the blue hour, the great colors you get. And I thought this would be perfect for a panorama. Nice long image like this. Took a couple of photos stitched together and produced this final image. It's just fantastic and goes to remind me every time I see it what a beautiful part of the world we live in here on Vancouver Island. So every year I try to go on at least one photography-related conference or workshop. This past year was no exception. This particular conference that I went to was 3 days long, and there were opportunities before or after the day's lectures to go out on little side trips with them. We also could go out on our own if we want. This occasion for the photo of the trading post at night was set up by them, and a portion of us were able to go to it. It's lit primarily by the moon. There was a crescent moon, if I remember correctly. And you can see the shadow in front of the building cast by the moon, which is, looking at it, it would be to the far left of the image, sort of behind the trading post. At the front, there was a single LED light panel just gently lighting up the front, almost so that you couldn't see anything on a normal exposure, just looking straight at it. But of course, with a nice long exposure, and this was 30 seconds, you could see much more of the building lit up. And I think it balanced off nicely with the moonlight. On the way to this conference, I had noted this building here, which is a colliery building. There was actually a collection of several of them, and they were some sort of historic site. As you can see from the image, they were pretty much wide open. They actually had no roof on these either. And I thought it would be great to be able to come back to this and get a night photo. I was hoping for some nice stars in the sky and to get the Milky Way or something behind it. But unfortunately, the only night I had that was free happened to be one that there was clouds and no fog in the sky. So you can see in the background a little bit of glow from distant lights that give a little bit of color to the sky and some faint clouds on the one side. But the building itself, I had put a small, very dim red light in. And again, this is a long exposure, so it gave it that red glow from the inside. And the outside, I just simply did some quick light painting with a white light. Now, if you look very close, down near the center window, the center archway, towards the bottom, you'll see a yellowish color. That was actually from a tiny bit of light that was seeping out under the door of some sort of maintenance closet. And it was very dim to the naked eye again. You could see a little bit of light there, but nothing that lit up the building at all. But again, this is the long exposure technique. It sort of amplifies the amount of light that's getting into the camera sensor. And this is what it gave us. Staying with the night theme, I do try to do astrophotography. It's something that I want to start doing more of. And several times throughout the year, I took the opportunity to go out and try and take some nice night photos, get the astrophotography going. And on this particular occasion, I was actually leading my local photo club to do some night shots. And we went down to a local area here called Whiffen Spit to do that. We picked that because it's close, easy to get to, and relatively deserted that time of night. Unfortunately, there's some light pollution around, and that night there happened to be some fog that started to roll in, but it added to the atmosphere, and I think it made this photo here in particular pretty interesting. You do have the stars in the sky, and again, you can see the sky's not pitch black because of that light pollution that's there, and so the stars in the Milky Way aren't really standing out. And the yellow glow of the lights behind the peninsula there is actually coming from across the strait in Port Angeles, because there's only very few houses that are actually on that peninsula. They don't throw off that much light. And with the foggy conditions and low cloud back there that had started rolling in from the south, it really reflected on that and gave it that unique look. I thought it was quite interesting. I hope you like that one. And for the 10th and final image in my selection, this is something that was from this past November, and it's actually quite close to where I am. Many of the streams this past year took a long time to either come back to life or to flow more fully. And same with the waterfalls. Some of them were extremely low late into the year and even completely dry for some time, much later than they would normally be. That meant all the salmon runs were late as well and threw off a lot of things. I actually came down here because the rivers were flowing much better by November, and there were bears in the area. So I thought I might be able to get a photo of a bear down here. And of course, my typical luck, anytime I'm out with my good camera, long lenses, I never see much for wildlife. I see them occasionally and not too far away, but I don't have anything other than maybe a smartphone with me. So that's not the greatest for taking a photo from a distance of wildlife. And I'm certainly not getting close to a bear if I don't have to. Anyway, these three trees here along the bank seem to be stretching their roots towards the water like they want to take a nice big drink. Did a little bit of work with them just to lighten them up a little bit more so they stood out a bit more. And the one tree on the rear right corner of the picture, upper right, I darkened that just slightly so it didn't stand out as much, because those three trees along the water's edge are really what I wanted you to focus on, and they were my interest, along with that pattern of the water. And well, this was a long exposure. It wasn't that long. It was only 0.3 of a second. So it was long enough to get a little bit of motion in there, but definitely show the streaking of the water and not just a pure white blur like you see in some photos. So just looking at the photo, instinctively you might think it's flowing, the water flowing from the mid left side down to the lower right side. But looking a little closer, you can see it's actually going in the opposite direction. It's just a bit of an optical illusion trick the mind plays when you see water at that angle coming down. You're used to seeing things from left to right and water flowing downhill. So this almost looks like it's going the opposite way, but it's not. It is going from the right to the left in this photo. I just thought the pattern of the water feeding those trees was, again, something that looked really interesting to me and tells a story in itself. So those are the top 10 favorite photos I created in 2023. This is something I do every year for at least 5 years, probably more than that. One of the main reasons I put this list together is so that I can share it with you and anyone else who's interested in photography and Vancouver Island photography in particular, because that's where most of my photos are from, although I do sometimes get out farther. Another reason is so that I can review my photos myself and make some observations about my style and where I'm going and how I'm developing. So here are a few things that I'm realizing this year from reviewing my photos. First, most of my favorite photos were from the first half of the year. I have noticed the later half of the year, while I had the desire to get out with my camera, I often found it difficult to pick a destination and get out there and start shooting again. Next, several of my favorite were night or astro images, even though those are a much smaller percentage of those photos that are in my photo library. I really enjoy night photography and would love to do more, but I often find it difficult to get out on a clear night to a good location that's going to look good with the stars and preferably something in the foreground. I like to have a whole scene and not just stick to just the stars. Another thing I noticed was that there was only one image that was not some form of long exposure, with the second one being 0.3 of a second, which I think I mentioned earlier. The other 8 were all true long exposures. A couple of those had to be long exposures because they were at night, but most of them were done for aesthetic choice. Many of those required the use of neutral density filters in order to slow down the shutter speeds enough to get the desired results. And now that I've got some case filters, the magnetic style, they're really easy to use, and I've really enjoyed using them. So I think that's contributed a lot to my long exposure images. I also noticed that 4 photos were from overnight or longer trips, and that one of the other ones was a 3-hour drive away from here, where I live. And of course, a 3-hour trip back, which I did in one day. I don't do that often because that doesn't give me a lot of time. And often it's not during the best light when you would get there, or you have to leave really early. In this case, that photo happened to be the snowbirds photo, and they had set times they were going to be up. So it worked fine with that. It did make for a long day with a lot of driving, for less time actually at the location and shooting, but that was fine. Anyway, I don't get away nearly as often as I'd like, but these photos really show that while I enjoy photographing near home here, getting out to other locations farther away really inspires me, and it feels like it's something new for me to photograph. So I think I probably need to do more of that. Interestingly, despite doing a fair bit of city and street photography during the course of the year, none of those photos made it into my favorites. Yes, there were many that I liked, but none of them were personal favorites for me, and they just didn't make it onto the list. And one final observation I'll point out here of my own images was that 5 of them included the ocean, 1 had a waterfall, another had a stream, so it was very obvious that water plays a big part in my photography. That and many of my photos are in forested areas, and those two things in particular really play a big part of my photography. Good part of that is because of my location here on Vancouver Island. Being an island, we're surrounded by the ocean, and there's certainly plenty of green and waterfalls and streams around, but it's also something I truly enjoy. Even when I go to other locations, if there's water around, it'll probably be in some of my photos. So what does all this mean for my year to come? Well, I already have plans for some multi-day trips. One probably well over a week. I don't know if I can stretch it to two, but it's in the planning stages. And another one at a conference, which is several days, and I'll extend that by a couple more nights to get some extra photography on in that area. So hopefully I'll also get a chance to do some overnight excursions here on the island, so I don't have to drive for several hours one way and several hours back. I'll also be keeping an eye out for more opportunities to get out at night, do astrophotography, different night photography techniques, and see what I can come away with there. Part of that is looking for good locations that'll work for that and where the weather is going to cooperate. I do actually have a lot of other thoughts and some very loose plans for the year ahead, including reawakening my YouTube channel, which you're watching this on now. So I thank you very much for that. Keep an eye out here for some new videos. If you haven't already, I'd really appreciate if you could like the videos that you like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much. I hope to see you, or to have you see me rather, on some videos here in the near future.